Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Stafford's County Hospital has suspended accident and emergency services for children because of a lack of professionally trained and experienced staff. The announcement came as health chiefs warned that there is a growing gap between what the NHS can afford and what it's being asked to do. Our health and social care correspondent, Victoria MacDonald, has spent the day at Grantham District Hospital in Lincolnshire, which has announced that it's to close its doors at night because of a shortage of emergency doctors.
It is, the bosses here say, only a temporary measure, closing the A&E department overnight because there aren't enough doctors to staff the Lincolnshire Trust's other two emergency units.
The decision to close the A&E here overnight has, of course, caused controversy, at least locally. There are even threats of legal action. But the Trust says it's the only way that it can guarantee providing a safe service across all its hospitals. More than that, though, this is a sign of a deeper problem across the health service. And now there are calls for a proper debate with the public about what has to give to keep the NHS on track.
And the release of spending figures today, along with performance levels, highlight the tensions. NHS hospitals in England had a deficit of £461 million in the first 3 months of the financial year. That is a big improvement on last year, but it includes a £450 million one-off grant, somewhat taking the shine off. And even before these numbers were released today, another trust announced it was closing its A&E to children. County Hospital in Stafford said it was on safety grounds. And Chorley Hospital in Lancashire has also closed its emergency unit. Grantham A&E was closed to keep open the Trust's other emergency departments, including this one at Lincoln, where the situation came close to being dangerous.
3 or 4 weeks ago at 7:30 in the morning, we were informed that there were 25 patients in the accident and emergency department, I think 1 or 2 in resuscitation, but the day team that were due to come on, the middle grade, had rung in sick, and the locum consultant that was meant to start had indicated that he wasn't coming in. So we were then faced with a department full of people where the night shift were going home and we had nobody then to start the day shift.
These closures are about staffing, the difficulty of recruiting doctors, but performance figures today show just how severe the pressure is across the NHS. 3.45 million patients now on the waiting list for elective care, including operations. 300,000 more patients in A&E than at the same time last year, and a nearly 61% increase in trolley waits. Now, the Health Secretary and the head of NHS England have been challenged to acknowledge the problem and start that debate.
Every NHS member of staff will do their absolute best to ensure that care quality is maintained and that services are of the right quality. But what our members are now saying is they cannot carry on with that with the level of funding available, and we need an honest, realistic, open debate about what the NHS does to cope with the much lower levels of funding increase we're going to see next year and the year after.
Smaller trusts are now being asked to see if there are marginal services that they can close or move to larger hospitals. But with NHS funding due to fall sharply over the next 2 years, few think that will be little more than a sticking plaster.
Victoria MacDonald. Well, we did ask to speak to a minister from the Department of Health or anyone from NHS England, but no one was available. Joining me now is Labour Shadow Health Secretary Diane Abbott and Mark Diane from the Nuffield Trust.
Good evening.
Mark, Diane, why do you think politicians need to be more honest with the public about what the NHS can and can't do?
Well, I think if you look at what we're seeing at the moment, it's clear that the service is already under tremendous financial strain. And what our research has done is to look forward and see what sort of savings the NHS will have to make, what it'll have to do to keep going with the budget envelope that's set down to it. And what we see is that there'll have to be, within the money that's currently being granted, incredibly ambitious savings, both inside hospitals being more efficient and stopping the rising number of patients coming forward from happening quite so quickly. And both those are really unknown territory. They're things that may not even be possible at the rate they're required.
So this applies to all politicians, and not just the government?
I think, you know, that the more that this is discussed, the more that the public start to think through what some of the options are, the better, really.
Diane Abbott, I mean, do you think you are being straight with people when you make promises about the NHS and renationalising and what you can deliver?
I've only been Shadow Secretary of State for Health for a month or so. I think it's right that we need an honest and open debate with the public, and we do have to begin by accepting the NHS is underfunded. And we also have to recognise that some very short-sighted cuts in local government, particularly the money available to local government to spend on social care, has put a lot more pressure on the NHS, whether it's older people coming into A&E, or whether it's people who ought to be discharged but are occupying beds because the social care isn't available. But we also need to look at how we bear down on costs. PFI is going to cost the NHS upwards of £2 billion for at least the next decade, and there are ways of trying to manage down the PFI payments. I've been talking to CEOs of big London teaching hospitals who want to buy out their PFI because with interest rates so low, it's cheaper to do that than pay the PFI
But are you
money.
prepared to say the NHS can't realistically do this or that or whatever? We've got to be limited. I mean, you know, because at the moment, I read your plan or the plan in your article, and it was all about what you can achieve, not what we're going to have to be realistic about.
You know, the people like you who say we have to be realistic are trying to say that we should lean more heavily on private care. But we know in the US...
I'm saying you're going to have to be realistic about what the NHS can and can't do. I'm saying, are you prepared to say there are things the NHS can't do?
No, I'm prepared to be realistic about the costs, and we have to be realistic about how we meet those costs. And there are ways of, I think, bearing down on costs through looking at things like PFI, the amount of agency staff, what we spend on drugs. But actually, at the end of the day, we need an NHS which is free at the point of use and gives everybody, irrespective of where they live, a decent standard of care.
Is this the kind of honest debate you mean when you're talking about an honest debate with the public?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, these are real issues. PFI does cost money, although it's slightly difficult to see what you can do about it now. Agency staffing, as Diane mentioned, is a real issue, as are drugs prices. But at least in the longer term, perhaps beyond this Parliament, even if the NHS does meet these very ambitious savings target, then there will have to be a conversation about, does the NHS need more money, and considerably more money? And if it does, is that going to come from taxation, borrowing, cuts to other public services? Because those are really the only options on the table. Isn't
it just an admission of defeat, though, if you start saying we can't do this, that and the other? I mean, this debate has gone on for as long as the NHS has been around, you know, rationing, what we can't do. Why do we need to start saying now that there are things we can't do when we've managed to get away with it for so long?
The NHS and other health systems have never been able to do everything that could be possible. You could spend an almost infinite amount of money getting tiny increments of extra healthcare benefit out, and indeed, arguably, in some cases, we go too far at the moment. A line has to be drawn somewhere. What we're saying is just that the public need to be involved in that debate, and then there needs to be a real national conversation thinking about how much we want to put in and what we want to get out.
I agree there needs to be a national conversation. What you have to remember is people are living older with multiple conditions. When the NHS was set up, people died at 60. Now they're living to their 80s with blood pressure and diabetes and so on. So there needs to be an honest conversation.
So demands are greater?
Of course, and expectations are greater, so we need an honest conversation. But at the end of the day, the Labour Party is saying it has to remain free at the point of use, although we have to examine how we fund it.
And there's nothing you would rule out? There's no treatment you would start saying, we can't afford that anymore?
Would you want to go to hospital and have someone say to you, you know, Christian, we can't do anything to your leg because we can't afford it today? You wouldn't want that, and I'm not going to have that happen to my constituents.
Do you think that needs to happen, Mark Dan?
Look, that's one of a range of very difficult options that people might need to look at. And, you know, there will be some cases where the clinical advantage of an operation, for example, on somebody who's already very unwell from many other illnesses, might be relatively marginal. And in those cases, you could have a conversation like that. But, I mean, I certainly think that the British public are firmly supportive of an NHS that continues to provide the bulk of healthcare in a comprehensive way. I don't see that changing.
And you think that's exactly what the government want to change?
We know...
I mean, why do you think Jeremy Hunt kept his job?
You need to ask Theresa May. I mean, because Jeremy Hunt lied to Parliament and lied to the public about 7-day-a-week NHS when he knew his own officials were saying he didn't have the money, he didn't have the staff to have those improvements in a 7-day-a-week NHS. I mean, there's always been elements in the Tory party, and you will know better than I, who've wanted to push towards a US-type insurance-based system, always.
We must leave it there. Diane Abbott, Mark Diane, thank you very much indeed.
I've been getting